Please do. Don't hesitate to interrupt with questions or anything, okay? Well, hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Inman, and I work at the Center for Gifted Studies on the campus of Western Kentucky University. And I say on the campus right now, we are working from home. The majority of us, as I'm sure some of you are too. Your kids are certainly learning from home right now. And we're going to talk tonight about some of the stresses and pressures that brings. In fact, this is the fourth out of the 7-part series. And tonight we will focus on the social and emotional issues. And quite honestly, the majority of the phone calls that we get at the Center for Gifted Studies focuses on social emotional issues when it's coming from parents, not necessarily the cognitive issues. We kind of live, eat, and breathe with our children, don't we? Did you know, and if you were at Lynette Breedlove's session last month, you were familiar with this, did you know that gifted kids rarely are equally mature in all areas? We call this asynchrony. So for example, if you've got someone you've got a second grader who is an average second grader, you're going to see that in physical, cognitive, social, and emotional areas, they're right across the board second graders. If you have an above average student, it's the same thing. They might be a second grader in age, but right across the board, third grade behavior, emotionally, socially, etc. But when it comes to gifted kids, they are all over the place. And that causes a lot of problems. You might have, your child may go up and talk to the teacher about social injustice and what needs to be happening. And he's only a second grader, but as he comes back, he's going to bop the kid in the head with his elbow just because he could do that. So you're all over the place. And that leads to quite a few issues, specifically with adults tending to treat them as older than they are because they do, they can understand at such high levels. I know this is lengthy, and I am going to read it. I've kind of put in blue those important areas, and I want you to know that this comes from a study that's in the references section at the end. That's from the National Association for Gifted Children. That's our primary national organization for advocacy. And this comes from a study that was on the whole gifted child. So we're looking at every aspect of the child, just not that cognitive part. So bear with me. Being gifted creates an additional layer of complexity for this human experience. Let that sink in for just a moment. Gifted children perceive the world differently than their average peers. Whether having a deep intellectual understanding of circumstances without the requisite experience to effectively process emotional responses to the circumstances, that would be that uneven development where I'm understanding it, but I can't process it on an emotional level. For example, like social injustice. Awareness that those around them do not have the same complexity or depth of comprehension on a given topic or in a given setting. When I realize that my sibling, even though I explained it, doesn't get it, and I couldn't be any more straightforward. So that can cause peer problems. Or the capacity to visualize the ideal without the capacity to actualize it. That perfectionism, where I know what I want it to look like, and this is not it, so I'm not going to turn it in. The lens through which gifted children experience the world is fundamentally different than the vast majority of their peers. So with gifted children, you are looking at someone who will handle all of the stresses and the worldly experiences that the typical child has, layered with this complexity that could affect, as we saw in that asynchronous development, lots of areas of the child's life. Now, this isn't every single child that we're talking about. Not every gifted child's going to have perfectionism. It's going to vary, but I do want to discuss what are some of the issues that most children deal with. Did you know that their traits may be interpreted positively or negatively depending on the person? So these kids are hardwired. They come out into the world with certain characteristics that are similar for a lot of gifted children. For example, a lot of gifted children are very curious. They want to know all sorts of reasonings and depths, and they have lots of questions. But this can be interpreted very positively, like this teacher would say, wow, Sean has such a thirst for knowledge. He asks so many questions in class. But another teacher may say, LaShawn questions everything I say in class. He is so disrespectful. Is LaShawn acting any differently in those two classes? Nope. It is the filter through which that teacher is seeing. I love how he logs on first thing each morning, eager to share some tidbit of knowledge he learned, whereas the other, NTI is hard enough without LaShawn trying to log in 20 minutes early to talk about something not even class related. You know, I counted how many times LaShawn asked why or how in one class. 14. Can you believe it? You know, I counted how many times LaShawn asked why or how in one class. 14. Can you believe it? LaShawn's curious. He's going to ask lots of questions. If that teacher understands that that's how gifted kids are hardwired, they're not trying to be uh, rude, they're not trying to balk at authority, they're honestly just asking questions, that's going to be a much better experience for that child and the teacher, honestly. Okay, so how about LaShawn at home? Because this happens too, where parents or caregivers, their adults and their family look at them differently. I swear I do get tired of answering all of his questions, but I have to chuckle at him. That boy loves to learn. That will take him far in life. If that child asks me why one more time, I will explode. LaShawn really makes me think about reasoning for why I set bedtime the same for him and Latrell. He is older than she is. He questions every single rule. He forgets sometimes that he is the child and I am the parent. It's so much fun for me to watch him move from topic to topic. It's like I see his mind growing right in front of me. I swear, by the time I get the stegosaurus he has to have for his birthday, he's forgotten about dinosaurs and now wants some science fiction toy. LaShawn is curious. Yes, that can take him far in life. Yes, that can exhaust the adults in his world who are having to answer question after question after question. But that's who he is. So it's really important that we understand that is who he is. And this is an example for curiosity. We could take that with any of the traits, honestly, that gifted children have. For example, intensity. Gifted kids are intense. I swear I do get tired of answering all his questions, but I have to chuckle at him. That boy loves to learn. That will take him far in life. Yes, that was the exact same one, right? He's asking lots of questions. I swear if he gets a hangnail, he's going to die. They're so similar when they do something. They go all the way. Two gifted kids. One's a complete slob and the other color codes his closet. Yeesh. Sometimes I think I could just listen for hours when he starts talking about basketball. He knows every stat for every player. He's even memorized their schedule. I wish I had that passion for something. Sometimes I can't get a word in at all. He goes on and on and on. And when he finally stops, I've forgotten what I was going to say. So, when you know that gifted kids come hardwired with certain personality traits and characteristics, you have to realize that that's who they are. And as they grow and mature, part of what we do as adults is help them hone those traits because, we sure don't want LaShawn to lose his curiosity. And that can happen if he gets in trouble for it all the time, right? So, the very interpretation that the adults in a child's life has can make them extremely vulnerable. Let's look at some of those ways. Did you know these kids have unique stresses and dynamic issues associated simply with being gifted? So, let's look at some of those. One deals with traits. These children tend to be very sensitive, which is an incredible trait. It means they have great empathy for others. They care about feelings and quality of life. And this also, there's a desire for them to want to be accepted by others, to have friendships. They're very sensitive to those relationships. But sometimes they're too sensitive when someone says something critical, and it can be something as simple as, you know, I think this sentence could be stronger. For example, a teacher talking. I think this sentence could be stronger if you added those sentences together, combined them. And that child may take that as a very personal affront. Or if a peer rejects them as they want to sit down at lunch at their table. And that causes great problems. They can feel different and alienated from this, depending on how it's handled. And there is a strong need for recognition for a lot of these people, especially when they're young. Gifted children tend to have very diverse interests and abilities. There's a great versatility there, which is an incredible asset. But they may appear scattered and disorganized, and at times they certainly are. They may get frustrated because there's just not enough time to dig into what I want to dig in, and now you're making me go do something else. And they can be pretty hard on themselves and expect to be, I have all these interests and I should be at the top of every single one of them. I should be able to answer any question about them. And that's just unrealistic. Which of course leads into they have high expectations for themselves and for others. And realize we are generalizing with this. This won't be every child. For some kids, this becomes perfectionistic. There is a rigidity in how they think and in what they expect of themselves and what they expect of others. And sometimes nothing is going to be good enough. So that can lead to disappointment in themselves, disappointment in others. With the holidays coming up, whether it's Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, Christmas, whatever you happen to celebrate, if you do celebrate, sometimes those expectations can be super high, especially as you watch the Hollywood version of what it's supposed to look like. And disappointment occurs with that because nothing's going to be perfect, right? Gifted children also tend to think very critically. Sometimes that can lead to being self-critical and self-evaluative, also evaluative of others. And that by itself isn't a necessary bad thing. I mean, oftentimes we see the word critically and we think it's a negativity. Critically just means you're doing it with an objective eye, you're being very analytical. And that's actually how we grow. But sometimes that can lead towards being intolerant of others. Your child doesn't want to be in a small group because he knows he's going to get a higher grade if he just does it himself, right? Sometimes when the child has too high expectations, super critical, can be depressed. This isn't supposed to be my life. I'm supposed to get a full scholarship to college and I'm not getting it. They can also be disappointed in others. Gifted children tend to enjoy structure and order. So they like categorizing to systematize things. But this also can be seen as very rigid. Sometimes it's overly complicated. They want to play a game and they're going to make sure all the rules are there and it's very literal following of the rules, or they may complicate something. They may jump in when it's not being done the way it's supposed to be done. So this can be a negative trait. These are all things that children need to understand how to hone them. Gifted children, and I say children, but it's gifted adults. It's all those folks who are advanced learners. There is a love of truth, a love of equity, of fair play. And we know that that doesn't always exist in the pure form, does it? Sometimes it's hard for them to be practical. This may cause them to worry extensively about things as they love it deeply and intensely. It leads to humanitarian concerns. And with COVID-19, that is so real. There are children who have trouble going to bed at night because they know some of their classmates may not have dinner and not have a parent looking out for them and tucking them in at night. And these are all very real things. Sometimes because of that asynchronous development, kids can seem too serious for a child of their age. And there's nothing, well, all children are different, right? You're looking at that norm here. Sometimes they do become overly concerned about things that they can't control. Morality, ethics, philosophy. For example, the concept of evil. Why does evil exist? Most second graders aren't thinking about that, are they? Some do, though, and it's pretty hard to tackle, especially when you're trying to deal with, to break it down into concepts that a child of that age can not just understand on the cognitive level, but be able to relate to in some way. So that's one of those unique circumstances that the characteristics can bring about, or the issues that gifted children deal with that other kids might not deal with. Another one is divergent thinking. Our gifted learners tend to be divergent in their thinking, not convergent. And basically, most of us are very linear thinkers. We go from one thing to the next as we're solving a problem. Or we find out this clue, this clue, this clue, and that helps us solve our problem. Well, divergent thinkers aren't like that. They get the question and then they go in all of these different directions and they make linkage to all these different things and they're going farther and farther and more broad, but they're making connections. So this might be a child who raises his hand and answers something in class, and the rest of the kids just look at him like, what the heck how is that even related? But that child is thinking about it, and the thinking kind of goes like that, whereas most of ours doesn't. So divergent thinking can cause some issues. Now, I'm going to read a little vignette to you. This is Chris. Chris is age 11 and she loves to make puns. If you ask Chris to get something from the pantry, and she will picture an oak tree with hanging pots and pans, pantry. Shadows and shapes assume sinister tones as meanings and perceptions shift with her moods. Chris is highly creative in art and writing. Her poetry is exceptional for her age and form, sensitivity, and depth. She's also interested in science and, on her own initiative, is working after school on an original biology project. Despite her academic successes, Chris is often unhappy at school. She feels misunderstood by both peers and teachers. She complains to her parents that she is different from others and has no real friends. So when we look at someone who has divergent thinking, this is going to be someone who really looks at things very unusually, an original approach, not just to the thing itself, but to the idea of it. So we're not talking about kids who are perhaps, writing a book or painting a picture. This divergent thinking and creativity deals with the thought patterns. You think differently from others. These are going to be the ones who solve our world's problems, right? The first reaction is probably not going to be the first reaction of other people. You may see humor in responses that the teacher gets or the parent gets, and other people might not. They could be so lost in their head that they seem inattentive, even rebellious, as they are trying to work through the connections that they're making in their head. They could just go with the idea and see where it takes them. Sometimes it takes them in so many places that they really have a hard time making decisions, setting priorities. Sometimes it feels very different without understanding. They can tend to feel alone at times. And divergent thinkers also can appear to be very disorganized, absent-minded, losing things, that sort of thing. So for divergent thinkers, and not all gifted kids are creative thinkers, quite a few of them are. And in Kentucky, we actually have creativity is a category of giftedness, just like that intelligence is. But performance and behavior can cause problems at home and at school, especially long-term issues for the child when the curious questions are shut down, when the unusual answers have eye rolls in responses, when they tend to look at morbid types of things in their imagination and they're trying to work out problems, and negativity comes to that whenever they think about that or express themselves, it can really shut them down. So what can we do? I'll let you read this one on your own. This is a dose of reality. The world we live in is not a kind world. It's a hostile world. Regardless of that, the child needs to find a sense of self and be proud of that and know that not everyone's going to appreciate it, but that's okay too. So there should be joy in their thinking and in their creativity and their play. They should focus on process instead of product. And what that means is if you have a child who is, let's say, making a present for someone for the holiday season, a present for Hanukkah, and they spend quite a bit of time on it and they think about what the person likes, and then they're trying to use favorite colors as they're creating it, find something that feels good to them and create it, and that whole process. And then when they get it finished, if they only focused on giving that product to the person, there will be some loss in that. It needs to be focused on how much joy was taken, not just in giving the product, that gift, but also in creating it and thinking about their person all the way throughout. They need to learn what is an appropriate risk and what is not an appropriate risk. Jumping off of the roof to hit a trampoline or a pool or something like that, that is not appropriate risk taking. This is tough too. Because they will be such different thinkers, these divergent thinkers, they have to break themselves away from that negativity and the criticism. But they also need to get the social conventions. When is it, when are puns appropriate in social situations, for example? And of course, they always need to find their people. That's why gifted and talented services are so important, especially when those are done in such a way that gifted kids are with other gifted kids. And you'll see that in what we call a cluster group, where those kids are put together with the same teacher who's had training in gifted. It can be in pull-out programs where they might go once a week. And that looks different on NTI. I do know that some school systems are still having their kids meet at a different time from others so that they get enrichment with that. Saturday programming, summer programming, all of that can be so incredibly important for this. So when we look at children and the special issues they may face because they're gifted, we know that the traits they have can be interpreted in multiple ways, that their traits can manifest in multiple ways. We know that for those who are divergent thinkers, there are some roadblocks there. Gifted kids also tend to be very sensitive, and there are roadblocks there as well. We met Chris last time. This time we're going to meet Paul, and Paul is a 4-year-old gifted boy. And when he was 4, he told his parents he wanted to give away some of his favorite toys so that another boy would have toys for the holidays. No one knew where Paul had gotten the idea, but after he insisted for several days, his parents allowed him to give away the toys. Afterwards, Paul sometimes felt happy thinking of his toys having fun with the new boy. A depth of feeling that results in a sense of identification with others, animals, people, nature, the universe, characterizes the trait of sensitivity. Passion and compassion are two different approaches to that, or aspects. Passion refers to the depth of feeling that colors all life experiences and brings complexity and intensity to our emotions. Passionate people form deep attachments and react to the feeling tone of the experiences. So they're almost like thinking with their feelings. And that's what we mean by being very sensitive. So when they see someone else suffer, they may not be able to separate themselves from that person. They feel the hurt that the person does. And this is really tough when you have this in your family, especially as a parent or a caregiver, because you are having all these emotions with COVID going on and the stress and anxiety and loss of jobs and loss of life and the political situation we have and the protest. I mean, it's just so complex that it's really difficult to shield children from the emotions and what's going on. And if you have a gifted child who's very sensitive, he can read your body language. She can tell what you're not saying, and that's how you feel. And then that person takes it on. It's really tough. So sometimes when children sense that, they will feel it's their responsibility to make you happy. It's their responsibility to make sure your needs are met, to do what he or she can to help you. And that's not a child's responsibility. When they're very empathic, where they're actually in the same wavelength, if you would, with other folks, it means sometimes they feel the same feelings as the other one does, that they're not able to say, what are my feelings that I have versus what are your feelings that you have. So, what this one means basically is when you're dealing with the concept of morality, a child is not going to give in to some rationalization that you're going to give, some explanation for it. Let's go back to pre-pandemic. You're driving in the car, somebody cuts you off. You might call him an idiot or something worse than that, and your child might say, well, that's not a nice thing. And you're trying to explain, well, but I was angry and he cut me off, and you give all that, and deep down the child's going to say, but it's not right. You can't rationalize that. At an early age, they will commit to people and to ideas, to the sense of truth, for example, or to grandmother. There's that strong connection. And luckily, they tend to focus on the potential of people rather than their faults. So, what can we do as the adult people in these kids' lives? I'll let you read that on your own. Quite honestly, this is something I think a lot of us adults can learn too. Every person is responsible for his own feelings and actions. You have to help them learn how to separate themselves, to have appropriate interpersonal distance. You want them to empathize with others, but you don't want them losing sleep at night and crying constantly because they can't separate that. And sometimes it's mental imagery that you want, for example, your child to be with their friend and help them through the death of a grandparent, perhaps because of COVID. So they're on the phone talking about it, but they have to maybe build a wall that, okay, so when I'm not talking with her, using Zoom or whatever, then I'm not going to be thinking about that, because if I think about it all the time, it makes me sad all the time. You also need to understand that it's like when little Paul wanted to give away his toys, it brought him great pleasure. And when we discourage that selflessness, it kind of takes away who the child is. So, so it's important to tune in to their sensitivity and help them hone it so that they are not so vulnerable all the time. What else aside from we look at divergent thinking, sensitivity? Let's look at perceptiveness. Gifted people are very perceptive. They can assess a situation pretty quickly. They can figure out what is that underlying issue. If somebody looks at something different from what they do, they're going to try to figure out why. Am I not looking at it the right way? I perceive that we have a different point of view. They are also able to see aspects at the same time. So they understand multiple layers that are going on, and it can be extremely complex, but they're able to kind of get to the core of an issue. That's why in the first point that came up here, when they wonder why there's something wrong, if it's something wrong with them, that's because they go to the core issue of, I believe you should wear a mask, and my best friend believes you don't have to wear a mask. Then that's that self questioning that goes on. Oftentimes we see this as intuition or insight with gifted children, and they seem wise beyond their years. This goes back to that rigidity, that sense of right and wrong. When you are perceptive, you are going to view the world from a concept of rightness, and you're not going to understand why other people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, because it's obvious that it's right. This can get us in trouble too, that truth is more important than feelings. The truth is what they're after. Sometimes they don't take into account how that makes other people feel. You look so much better since you lost weight, right? Now that's straightforward and truthful, but it's not the way that should be shared. Perhaps you look fabulous, right? Or stop it, you look great. So there's a clear sense of morality and honesty and dishonesty, right and wrong. All right. So what can we do when our gifted children, um, when there are issues with their perception? Well, you have to discuss the difference between absolute right, what is fairness in dealing with others, moral right. You need to explain gray areas with them, how different people approach things. They need to understand the complexity of that. They also need to know that there are times when truth is more important than feelings, and then there are times when feelings are more important than truth. Now, that doesn't mean you're having them lie, but somebody could say, what do you think of my outfit? And if you think it's ugly, you could at least say, oh, you've got red in it, and that's my favorite color. You're not lying. You're just diverting the issue a little bit. And that's a sophistication that needs to be taught to some folks. They also need to know that sometimes things are just totally 100% out of their control. They're going to have an interconnectedness right now with children all over the world who are suffering with COVID-19, who are dealing with education that's different, who are dealing with parents and or family members that they can't see because of it. And so this sense of interconnectedness is a wonderful way for us to focus on empathy and ethics. I think this is pretty unusual suggestion. By the way, I should have pointed out, Levesque wrote an article, and I've got that information down at the bottom. It's also in the references at the end. But she argues that perhaps they should study their peers as an anthropologist might, as you're looking at the rituals and beliefs of other children. For example, it can be very useful for children who are sensitive to teasing to see that most children do not share that sensitivity and may in fact regard teasing as a sort of game. Did you know the neuroanatomy of gifted people's brains affects their experiences beyond academics? Neuroanatomy, we're looking at the physical concept of the brain itself. It's different. It doesn't mean it's better. It doesn't mean it's worse. It just means it's different. And for some of our gifted children, that intensity takes on another level. There was a Polish psychologist, Dabrowski, who came up with the concept of how a lot of gifted people have what he called excessive energies. It's that intensity, that excessiveness, and the term overexcitabilities was put with this concept, and sometimes it's called OE for overexcitability. And he believed that overexcitabilities manifested in 5 different areas. Now, as we say this and as we start talking about overexcitabilities, for most of you, it's going to tick some boxes for you. It's going to seem familiar, but please know that not every gifted child has overexcitabilities. Okay, let's look here. We've got kids studiously working, they're learning, they're having fun while they're learning. And so that goes to that intellectual overexcitability. So we already know that kids are curious and they have a large vocabulary. And we could look at all those characteristic traits. But for kids who have intellectual overexcitabilities, it is much more intense than others. So for example, that moral thinking, it's a strict black and white line, perhaps. There's no gray at all. Whereas for other kids, that's not the case at all, right? That perseverance, risk taking, time management, I mean, it's there, great qualities. When these kids are identified and served, they can develop the perseverance, risk taking. They will have continuous progress, continuous growth that we want them to have. That moral thinking, they'll be able to learn about the gray areas. And of course, we want independent learners and lifelong learners. But when kids have overexcitabilities, they might not understand the value of productive struggle. because they haven't had to do that very often. When they are not identified and served, they lack challenge, and they may show behaviors that if they get bored in class, they're going to find something to entertain themselves. Sometimes this leads to underachievement, this intellectual overexcitability, because they can never reach that impossible goal that they've set for themselves when it comes to learning. They can be super critical of others. And for a lot of children, we call them underrepresented populations. Kids who are twice exceptional, that's the term 2E right here that we see. That means they have a disability as well as a gift. So they have multi-exceptionalities. We rarely find these kids, and they are not going to be identified and served. Kids who don't speak English as a native language, we have a hard time identifying them. And when we look at underrepresented populations, we're talking about kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds, certain minorities, kids of color, Black and brown specifically. And then when they have inappropriate services, this is a huge issue too. And then intellectual overexcitability can cause great problems. So what can we do? Show them how to find answers. They have that thirst. Remember the curious word that I had up there and all that went with it? They want to know. They want to learn. So show them the process, how to do a Google search, how to distinguish good sources from bad sources, how to figure out who you should be talking to if you really want to learn about the civil rights issues in Louisville, right? And so you are respecting their thirst and their passion. When we look at those who are very interested in those moral and ethical issues, encourage them to do something about it. Now, you don't suggest what it is. Let the child come up with a way to make the world better, even if it's a small way. And sometimes you just really need to call them out on things. If they're too outspoken, if they're too critical, it's not an intentional thing. I remember when my son went up to his third grade teacher and told her how stupid the spelling words were because he already knew how to spell them and he didn't want to have to write them 10 times each. Now, luckily, he was not in trouble for being disrespectful, although he could have been sent to the office. She realized his intent was he wasn't being challenged. So, but you've got to walk through those, the right way to do things. Wow, intense emotions. Look at that. What do we talk about when we're looking at emotional overexcitability? Well, gifted kids, we already know that they tend to form strong attachments, that they have an emotional depth that's unusual for other people. They have this self-understanding. They're able to make responsible decisions, have empathy for others. These are the things that we've talked about a little bit earlier. So this is what we see. But if someone has that huge a friend of mine said, think of overexcitabilities as a radar. Most of us have a radar that we have that collects the sounds and the different thoughts and things like that. But if you are a gifted person with an overexcitability, you have a dish that is collecting so much more than anybody else does. So it's overload. So if you have an emotional overexcitability, you may fall prey to the imposter syndrome. If you're not familiar with that, imposter syndrome, you've got a very high achieving person, maybe, for example, an adult who just got a huge raise. Wouldn't that be wonderful? A huge raise and a promotion. But that person would say, oh, I just got lucky. Anybody could have gotten that account. I happen to be at the right place at the right time. Instead of saying, I worked really hard to make that happen. So the imposter syndrome basically dismisses what your talents are, what your natural gifts are, and emotionally, you don't think you were really able to do all the things they say they do, right? You don't think that you are, you don't honestly believe in your abilities. So you're having an emotional response that, no, that's not me. Heightened sensitivities and intensities. You may cry, somebody who cries very easily, whether that's watching a Hallmark commercial on TV that gets them all weepy, or listening to a song, or seeing. I'll give you an example. We were playing a game one time, a board game, and one of the answers was that a cat, it was a choice that you could play, that a cat got run over, and the girl who picked that card got all weepy, and she's a 30-year-old because she loves cats, and it made her so sad to think that a poor cat could have that. And so this is an adult gifted person who's trying to live with these emotions that are way too much. You can have unrealistic expectations. Physical reactions. I get so upset about something that I suddenly have a migraine, or I have stomach issues. I don't want to go to school because I'm not really ready for the test, even though I am totally ready for it. And I will have stomach issues, so I can't go. Okay, so you can have physical reactions to your emotions. And these are debilitating. Okay, realize this is just not something that's um, irksome. It can be very debilitating, and overexcitability is not necessarily a good thing. Way overreacted. You get super angry at something. You get unrealistically sorry if you did something wrong, where you're crying and begging for forgiveness. It's that over the top intensity. Perfectionism, that can just be devastating to children, to the point where they don't do anything. They don't turn anything in because they feel like it's not good enough. It can get really bad. Existential depression. Depression is horrific. Existential depression is also horrific, but it deals almost with the point of why is man even here? What's the meaning in life? Not just my life, but in all of life. What is our purpose? When you have emotional overexcitability, you could have unrealistic fears, incredible amounts of anxiety, where you're worried about everything, not in a healthy way. So, what do? It's important that we teach our kids that they should accept all their feelings, regardless of the intensity. It's important for us to know this is not a choice they're making. This is a reaction they're having because of how they're hardwired. It doesn't mean it's okay for them to act that way in public or whatever, but you have to know it's not necessarily a choice they're making. You're going to have to hone that for them and teach them how to deal with it. So if you're not highly emotional, this is bizarre to you. You think that kid is so melodramatic. Oh my gosh, he's just going on and on about this. It's not that big of a deal. But when we realize that, okay, it is that big of a deal for him for whatever reason, and it's not a choice thing where he's trying to throw a fit, and you'll help them walk through it and help them learn how to handle those things better. And it's important that for kids who have emotional overexcitabilities, they need to know you could very well have a physical reaction because of this. And for some kids, it might be a full panic attack. It might be an anxiety attack, which is different too. A panic attack kind of comes out of nowhere. An anxiety attack is something where you're anxious and it builds and builds and builds. But we have to teach them methods of how to cope with those things. I'll let you read that. I think those last couple of lines are especially important. And when you're dealing with younger kids, they have less control, not always, but it's important to let them see what's happening to them, as they are starting to get revved up, as they're starting to get more and more excited. And for some, it could even be where you link it to a tangible item. For example, let's talk about a computer. And as they start to get more emotionally distraught, it could be a building process with the mouse being the least distraught and the keyboard being more than the mouse and the laptop screen being more than the others. And you might say, well, where are you on the computer? A lot easier would be on a number from 1 to 10. Where are you with anxiety? Where are you with whatever that emotion is? And let them see, are you to the sweaty palm stage? If you are, we know that means you need to step away and see how we can calm down. Teach them those coping skills. Dabrowski also argued that there was imaginational overexcitability. Now, most of our gifted kids have a strong imagination, which is great. It makes them strong visual thinkers. That imagination lets them have a good sense of humor. It helps them appreciate poetry, music, drama, all of these wonderful things that we experience in life. It allows them to have a detailed visualization of things. They're picturing perhaps a project that they want to do for class, and they will imagine every little teeny tiny detail of that. They may use metaphorical language, speak in metaphors, magical thinking. So imagination is very strong in most of our gifted children. But when you have an overexcitability in imagination, we're going to see issues with it. They may be totally spaced out. You've been talking to them and you realize that they haven't listened to a word you've said because the first thing you said, some word triggered an entire tangent for them to go to in their mind, and they're thinking about that and creating a story or whatever it happens to be. They're tuning out of life. I made this one 2 colors because imaginary friends can be extremely beneficial. And so many gifted kids have imaginary friends when they're younger. But if they have imaginary friends when they're 20, that's not so great, right? That needs to be encouraged, but also acknowledged, right? Imaginations can go crazy with fear of the unknown. Let's say, for example, your child is home. You're supposed to be home from work at 5 o'clock, and it's 5:05. And your child may have already figured out that, okay, you went out to your car, you got into your car. As soon as you were pulling out of the parking lot, you probably got into a wreck. And we haven't heard from them because the ambulance hasn't gotten there yet, and you're trapped in the car and you're going to die because the ambulance isn't there yet. And in reality, you may have stopped at the restroom on the way out of the building. So that fear of the unknown can cause excessive worry, but it can also stifle them taking chances in life. For example, summer camp. Never been to a summer camp before. I've never been away from home longer than maybe one night I spent at Nana's house. So how could I go to a 2-week camp? And I would imagine that I won't make any friends. I will eat lunch by myself. I'll eat breakfast by myself. I'll eat dinner by myself. I'm going to cry myself to sleep every night. I'm imagining all those things because I don't really know what it's going to be like. And then that stops me from doing any of those things, taking chances that are life-changing. The daydreaming becomes a detriment. Daydreaming is a delightful, pleasurable way to spend time, right? Daydreaming is fun. But if you are supposed to be paying attention in class, in a training, daydreaming is not appropriate at that time. So when you spend your time daydreaming in detriment to doing what you're supposed to be doing, maybe a list of chores that you've left for your child. So these overexcitabilities are negatives, right? Because that trait is so intense that it leads to dysfunction. There's that worst possibility in any situation. Good part of folks who have overexcitabilities and imagination, they remember their dreams, which is really cool, but they often react very strongly to them. So, night terrors, right? Sobbing if something happens. Even after they wake up, they're going to relive that, talk to you about it multiple times. I hope they're going to talk to you about it multiple times so that they can get insight, so that they can get help for that. So, what do we do? I'll let you read this first one. So, you know that people with good imaginations make wonderful storytellers. Um, but that's not always appropriate when you're making up part of what's going on. And sometimes they can confuse how it played out in their head with how it really happened. And so I think these are pretty good techniques that you can use, right? After something happens, jot down, draw what really happened, and then you'll be able to tell it better. Or know that, stop, I'm going to add some detail here that may not have happened, right? So you really do need to be able to differentiate between what is real and what is imaginary. I'll give you a strange example of this. When my brother was little, he was 3 years old and started crying in the kitchen, and mom asked him why. And he said, because that pig's in here and it's a mean pig. And she said, well, what pig? And he pointed over to the corner. Totally, he described what the pig looked like, and it was snarling and snuffing. And of course, there was no pig there. So mom said, shoo, and she pretended to get it away from him, and that placated him. So that's where, that imagination, you're working with it. And then he came back in a little while later and started crying again because the pig was still there. And so then mom realized, okay, this is something a little bit different. We need to walk through and talk about what is imagination and what is real. And so that's a crazy kind of conversation to have with a 3-year-old, but some of you are probably nodding your heads right now. So they need to be able to distinguish between those two things. I'll let you read that one. I honestly think having kids create their own organizational system is wonderful for any child. But encourage that imagination. Have a notebook by the bed. And if the child wakes up with a bad dream, have the child jot down notes or ideas about it so that you can process it and say, it's a dream. It's how your body, your subconscious is working things out. Maybe have something in the car so that the child can jot down ideas that comes to the child. So therefore you are validating it, you're helping to develop it, but you're also going to be able to distinguish between the two. Because you can use that imagination in your learning. And it's not just storytelling, it could be anything that you're doing. If you're creating something, you're thinking about all the possibilities with it, and it can be an incredible addition. All right, how about this one? What are we looking at? Sensual. Let's go back in just a second. Got a kid holding his ears, a girl looking at broccoli and carrots with great disdain, right? And another girl snuggling up her lovey, her little blanket. Sensual overexcitabilities perhaps may be the first weird thing that you might notice about your child who has an overexcitability. The good things about it is that they're very aware of all their senses. So, oh, this ice cream, it's so creamy and it tastes so good and it's yummy and it's going to be the best ice cream they've had because it's their flavor, and they will experience that in a way that other kids won't. The kid with the lovey, right? That texture, it's so soft and it's going to soothe me because it does other things for me than just making me warm. These kids tend to have a love for all sensory things, right? Sights, sounds, smells, touches, tastes. There's a strong aesthetic awareness. The way they see beauty may differ from how other people experience beauty. So they're getting that extreme pleasure from those senses that we have at the top, but it may cause them to overeat. If this is the best ice cream I've had, I might just eat the whole carton or sneak up in the middle of the night and get it. It's when that sensual experience overwhelms the brain, right? Where you're letting what you want and the pleasure of what you want take precedent over what you know is good. These are the kids who have very powerful reactions. For example, you may have a child who cannot stand to have a label in the back of his shirt, or socks. There has to be one kind of sock because you don't want a seam there at the end of the toe, because every pair of shoes the child puts on, he feels that and it drives him crazy. My son had a friend who would take his socks and take them out past his foot and then curl them in under, and he would rather have the seam um, under his foot than right there at the toes. These are the kids who can't concentrate if they're sitting in a classroom with fluorescent lights, because don't you hear that buzzing? Isn't that driving you crazy? How can you think with that buzzing going on? This could be the child that gets into an elevator with you and someone else, and that someone has cologne on, and tears start, or, ooh, that's awful, and just reacting and going on and embarrassing you probably, but it's that just extreme reaction to something sensual. You see this with children as they're going from baby cereal to solid foods. Textures play a very strong role. And you talk to adults now, like oatmeal. Well, I like the taste of it, but the texture's gross. They talk about different things. So all five of those senses will have come into play with sensual overexcitabilities, but it might just be one. For example, I'm going to have a very negative reactions to the way things feel. So that means every clothing piece I have has to feel a certain way. A pencil that I have may not have the ridges. Perhaps it has to be circular. And those aren't things that I'm just being picky about. Those are things that I really do. My radar picks up so much more of that than anybody else's, that it is distressing and I cannot cope with that. So it becomes a very negative experience for everybody. People with overexcitabilities crave the pleasure. They crave the softness or the sweetness or whatever it happens to be. And this is where you can get into trouble sometimes. For example, overeating. These people also have a need for comfort. When they have distressing sensual experiences, that need for comfort is extremely real. And maybe your child was one of the babies that had a pacifier, and if did not have a pacifier, there was no way the child was going to sleep. Or a favorite blanket. And if you didn't have the favorite blanket, there was no way the child was going to sleep. Or needed to hear the hum of a car, would fall asleep in a car, and you might get in the car and drive around the block 12 times, right? So these sensual overexcitabilities can really disrupt normal life. And again, a reminder, this isn't a choice the child's making. It's how the kid's hardwired, but we've got to do some things to work on it, don't we? And so what are those things? Well, whenever possible, let's create an environment which gets rid of the bad stimuli, right? Provides comfort. So you're going to let the teacher know if there's fluorescent lights. This might sound silly, but I want you to know that my child responds in this way. And try to figure out, perhaps when she takes tests, could she sit out in the hallway? You're going to try to figure out some sort of way to make it work. Provide appropriate opportunities for being in the limelight by giving unexpected attention or facilitating creative and dramatic productions that have an audience. And this is really an interesting thing, because so often kids who have these are in the limelight for bad reasons, right? Oh, I don't like this. I can't wear, and they're drawing attention. So this suggestion is find appropriate ways for them to have that attention drawn to them. And that can help lessen the need for that negative attention. and give them a chance to really just dwell in that sensual, soothing environment. Create a safe space for them. The Danish have a hygge, I think is how it's pronounced, Hygge, where it's a total place of comfort, where you think about the lighting has to be soft. You're going to have a very comfortable blanket, a chair that fits you very well. You might have your favorite book beside you, or whatever, something you're going to listen to, your favorite drink beside you, that you really try to focus and just de-stress by being in a place that's very pleasing and uplifting to you. And that's the way it is with this sensual overexcitabilities, is they do have to get rid of all the stressors that are around them all day long. The last overexcitability that Dabrowski talked about was that psychomotor, that physical overexcitability. And so when we're looking at gifted children, gifted children understand, it doesn't mean they do it, but they understand the important role that nutrition plays, that, you know, it has to be a nice variety of food, how exercise is important, discipline, you know, that's not, motivation is having you exercise for the first time, but being disciplined is exercising, you know, 3 days a week when you don't want to. Sleep is very important, although kids with psychomotor overexcitabilities may only need 4 hours of sleep a night, which can be very challenging to parents. So all of these things come into play, but when there's an overexcitability, the child could have chronic fatigue because there is no exercise, perhaps, or the nutrition is not going to be there. If they're not eating well, they're not sleeping well, kids with psychomotor overexcitabilities tend to have more illnesses. They tend to be overweight, right? Even anorexia, malnutrition. You know, this is true for a lot of us adults, workaholics. You know, we can't just sit. We have to be doing something all the time. You know, so if I'm sitting waiting for the doctor, I'm going to be balancing my checkbook, right? Or sending out emails that are very important. We can't just be, and that's the way it is with kids, that they can't just not be steeped in whatever they're doing. Makes them pretty irritable, makes them fidgety. In fact, it's interesting, and this would be for a totally different seminar, a workshop, but ADD looks, or ADHD looks very, very similar to gifted kids, because the traditional gifted child has a lot of energy, right? And is able to, might bounce from idea to idea. Remember in the beginning when we talked about dinosaurs, and now we're going on to science fiction. Kids who have trouble with attention deficit disorder will bounce from thing to thing to thing. They're going to look fidgety, right? But if you look at them, the difference between those two is a child who is gifted will be able to zero in and focus on what he wants to focus on. And when he is told or understands that he has to stop and go to something else, he might not be happy about it, but he'll do it. Whereas someone with ADD or ADHD, you're not going to see that. Even though they might be really interested in something, they're still going to kind of bounce around. So, you know, we've got a lot of kids who are gifted who are unfortunately medicated for ADD when they don't need to be. Now, I'm not saying you can't be gifted and have ADD. Of course you can. Of course you can. And if you have a psychomotor overexcitability, you are going to have that fidgetiness. What do? Make sure there is time for physical activity. Make sure it's all within the day. And over, I hear from NTI teachers, I hear from kids, they miss that verbal activity, talking to people. They come early or stay on late at class because they want to have time with people. Or I know one teacher who actually, they have lunch together, or she just has lunch and opens up her classroom, and so many kids come on just so that they can kind of chat with each other. So this is very, very important. And that's for regular kids, right, who don't have this overexcitability. So it's even more important for these children. Make sure it's in their lives. But please make sure it's not obnoxious, right? needs to be beneficial, not distracting. And we also want to make sure the kids with psychomotor overexcitabilities have free time for spontaneity, doing things they really enjoy. This next slide is going to put it all together. Let's see. Did you know that enfranchising the whole child, whole gifted child, requires that we look beyond a child's performance and instead look at the unique characteristics that enable him or her to leverage efforts toward achieving well-being, a state of being which may or may not be centered around the talent? Can I take just a moment and think about that? We have been talking about the concept of characteristics of how they're hardwired, overexcitabilities, the intensity that they can have, the divergent thinking, and all of that ties into who the child is as a whole. But oftentimes in school, that may not be what happens. And sometimes at home, that's not what happens. The attention goes to the talent itself. How do we develop this talent? It doesn't go necessarily to the whole child. And so what we need to be doing, and this is what this is saying, and it comes from the Whole Child Gifted Task Force report I mentioned earlier, is that we have to look beyond what that child is doing and writing and all that kind of stuff in school. We need to look at who he is as a person, who she is as a person, the whole child, the physical attributes, the emotional, the social. We have to focus on all of that and it may not actually be around the talent itself, because what we're looking for, folks, is a balance. And that's how we get that social emotional well-being, is we're looking at all the parts of the child. And we're looking at, okay, this is how the child was born. These are the skills that we want to develop. These are the attributes that are so important, but they may need to be honed a little bit. It's all a sense of balance. So if we look at this guy, well, he's got that physical balance, literally, doesn't he? Which probably means he did certain weightlifting. I'm sure he stuck to a certain diet to make sure that as he walked across the tightrope in this canyon, which sounds like maybe perhaps inappropriate risk taking, but as he does that, he is in the tip-top physical shape. Emotionally, notice the sense of concentration that's there. I'm sure he had to deal with a lot of discipline as he was getting ready for this. Socially, I hope that he was supported and able to do this. You look at that whole sense of balance as who he is. I want to share with you a video that talks about balance in a little different way. Think of the physical balance. Think about the fortitude, the discipline, the math that goes into that. How many can this man carry on his head? Unbelievable. I'm sure this is not something the man probably chose to do in life, but it was a sacrifice for his family, right? He's feeding his family. Balance comes in many shapes and forms. If you're familiar with the Muppets and Jim Henson, and I think most of us probably are, Kermit the Frog is most well known for the line, "It's not easy being green." Well, it's not easy being gifted either. That is the bulk of the presentation that I have, and there's my information. But I do want to point out to you some other things that I've included on this PowerPoint, because these are the references, all the things that I've shared. You can find them here. But I also want to point out some resources that are available to you. If you are not familiar with the National Association for Gifted Children, NAGC. Um, you should be, and that's nagc.org. As a parent, when you join, you get Parenting for High Potential, which comes out 4 times a year. It is filled with very practical articles that are short, easy to read, all research backed, but not real thick and scholarly to read. And they're on a wide variety of topics. So PHP is one of the benefits that you get. You can go, uh, this is another resource, Parenting Gifted Children 101. The best of Parenting for High Potential was recently put into a book, Success Strategies for Parenting Gifted Kids. And you can get that through proofrock.com, that's Proofrock Press, or through nagc.org. Now, all of those things cost a little bit. This one's free. NAGC has developed many resources, including tip sheets. Tip sheets are timely information for parent sheets, and they deal with many topics from Gifted 101 to finding your child a mental therapist, to supporting your gifted child during COVID-19. When you go to nagc.org and you can just put in tip sheets, you will find there are several dozen of them. But this one I think is especially important in today's world as we look at how are we going to manage these things. And I'm very excited to share this with you. Our state association is the Kentucky Association for Gifted Children. And the Kentucky Association for Gifted Children has put out a document on our website here. And there are so many resources for teachers to use and parents to use. I know that some of you with gifted children may be struggling with having appropriate amounts of challenge in the classroom right now. And God bless the teachers. I don't know how teachers can work any harder than they are working right now. They are absolutely incredible. So you may want to help them out a little bit. Here are wonderful resources, and this just shows a snippet of it, critical thinking and multidisciplinary, but each one of these will take you to a website where great things are happening. In fact, Minnesota, this is the State Department, Minnesota Board of State Department of Education actually linked CAGE's site. That's how powerful it is for folks. And then they also have other resources listed. So, you know, gifted kids can struggle socially and emotionally at any time. When the world is normal, they struggle. With COVID-19, it has been so different. With the political situation, with protest, and it doesn't matter which side anybody, there is turmoil, and these kids tend to be more empathetic. They have a stronger sense of social justice. It's very intense time for them. For some, the challenge isn't there in school. For others, the work is too intense. For some, they might need more guidance than they're able to get. You know, there are just so many things that are going on that as caregivers, and you know, we love our kids. You wouldn't be watching this if you didn't love your children, care about them. We need to tap into as many resources as we possibly can. So I hope that you will look at some of those that I've given you. And let me put my email up there as the last slide. And we still have some time left. So Jessie Thompson, who is our terrific moderator, she is the gifted coordinator for Jefferson County Public Schools. Maybe she can find, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and Jessie will send them my way. And I'll do my best to answer them. While you guys are thinking of questions, I do want to point out another resource that I haven't really talked about, and that is, excuse me while I'm doing this. I'm going to talk to you about the social emotional needs of gifted children. It's a great resource. And it focuses on the social emotional needs. And what I'd really like to point out to you is the resources here. There are so many, from looking at mental health folks, finding those who are trained. Uh, their resources are absolutely phenomenal. The Sing library is terrific. Let me show you what that looks like. If we look at the library, look at all the different kinds of articles that are here, focusing on boys, anxiety, twice exceptional, uh, diversity. It just goes on and on and on. And these are all written with lay people in mind, which means folks who aren't necessarily trained in gifted education. So that's excellent. Excellent.
Parent handbook, which, as a parent myself, as a former, in my former life, when I was working with the gifted center down in Florida, we recommended that quite a bit also to parents so that they had that resource, because it encompasses not just the academic side of your child, but it does encompass the
Right.
social emotional. And I know a couple of parents reached out in the chat and they want to have resources with identifying possibly those over excitabilities and
Mhm.
how to deal with them with your student, especially as they reach the teenage years, which we know in essence can be challenging. But
Of
when
course
you
it can.
but when you add gifted on top of it,
Yes.
it can be
It's
very difficult. So I think those books are going to be very helpful for quite a few of ours. I did have a mom also reach out, how the student can be supported in the school setting. I recommended the counselor as one of the first places to start, because
yes.
while they may not be 100% trained and gifted, they are trained in the social emotional side of a child.
They are. And now each school will have its own mental health professional there. So I think we're going to see some services being provided that there just wasn't the people around to make that happen before. I do want to point out this Living with Intensity. This happens to be the first edition. There's a second edition, but this is a fabulous book. And I notice it's not just for little kids. And this is actually a really nice one for gifted adolescents to read on their own. It gives them insight to who they are. And I would be remiss not to talk to you about Cage. We have our conference is coming up in February. It is going to be a virtual conference. We have some of the very best people in the United States coming, the biggest names in the field, which a lot of you might not recognize those names, but I can just tell you it's going to be great material. So this is a wonderful resource for you. There are also other conferences and opportunities that are available. And you can also join CAGE and NAGC at the same time for a reduced rate. And the folks at Cage Gifted can help you with that. It's a two-in-one deal that's just fabulous. Let me put this back up again. Are there any other questions?
Another question I had actually came from a parent asking what happens when you have a child who's gifted and the friend is not gifted, and how you can actually make sure that needs are being met, that your child is understanding the child who's not gifted, and vice versa, the child who's not gifted understanding how the gifted child might be reacting, whether it's over excitabilities or whether it's anything along those lines. Or do you have any recommendations in that regard?
And I think that's a very good question, but it also ties into siblings. That can be a very complicated issue when you have one exceptional child, a gifted child, and one an average learner, which, and believe me, normal's good because giftedness brings quite a lot of difficulties, or can, as we've seen. There is going to be an issue of parenting for high potential that focuses on gifted siblings, which should be a wonderful resource. And if you get in touch with me, I can help you with that. Um, as far as a resource that jumps out at me, looking at I'm gifted, but my friend isn't. I need to look to see, and I don't know if my colleagues who are on the line with me know of a resource with that specifically, but I could probably find some articles or something and send that your way. I know part of it is just looking at the differences in people. It's just, you look at your favorite foods. I like this. Do you like that? It's just the same kind of thing. I like to learn this and I like to learn that. So it's just kind of talking through with them that everybody's different, our tastes are different, our opinions are different, and it's all okay. But I will follow up on that. I'm sorry that I can't give something more specific.
No, that's okay. And I think that that's another time too where the parent can reach out to the counselor at the school if there was a particular
Yes.
issue that occurred. Again, in one of my other former lives, before I was working at the center down in Florida, I was a general education teacher and also the gifted teacher at the same time. And there
Yep.
were many times where we had to have whole class discussions about everybody being different and everybody
Yes.
seeing things differently and reacting differently, and teaching them at a very young age how to deal with that. And I think that this presentation, it's wonderful for all students, whether they're elementary, middle school, or high school, but it also shows the importance of, if we teach them at a young age how
Mhm.
to, I don't want to say deal with it, but how to use those coping strategies by the time they get to middle school and high school, when even more challenges are piled on top of them, challenges that they hadn't even imagined before, and challenges that as adults ourselves, we don't imagine them necessarily having at that age, but teaching them how to cope with it and how to overcome it, and giving them those strategies is so important in those younger ages, so that it's not lost time by the time they hit high school, even though all of these strategies can and should be used with our high school students.
I so agree with that, Jesse. And you also made me think, the first time that kids are in a setting where somebody looks different from them, their home life is different from theirs. Uh, you know, there are so many things that kids learn, and just a natural part of that is everybody's different. You might have a child who has a physical disability and they realize, oh, so in order for him to walk like me, he needs crutches. Or somebody who's blinded. It's all the part of embracing who we are. It's equity, right? We're looking and embracing the differences among us as human beings and making the world a better place because of that. This is just one of those oddities, right? The exceptionalities that fit into it.
Best if we partner with our schools, and as a parent, if you see something, if you hear something, please let the schools know.
Yes.
This is, like Dr. Inman said multiple times, this is an unprecedented time, and to partner with the school, to partner with the counselor or the teacher or the assistant principal or principal, to make sure that all of our students have what they need in regards to social emotional right now,
Yes.
is of the utmost importance. Of course, academics is also, but there are times when we can't get to the academic piece if the social emotional is not being met. So,
So
partnering
true.
with your school, partnering with the teachers, partnering with your staff, reaching out to Dr. Inman or even myself if
Mhm.
there is a particular focus that you want to hear more about. We are all about that. I had a parent ask about 2E students, and that is something that we are going to be addressing in the early spring. So we've tried to tailor these presentations knowing what parents are the most thirsty for right now and what is going to be the most applicable to our families, and making sure that we are taking care of the whole child. Again, academics
Exactly.
utterly important, but the whole child. If we don't take care of the whole child, that child may not be able to reach their full potential.
And Jesse, I'm going to add to it's not the whole child, it's the whole adult as well. It's not just the whole child. Parenting right now is maybe more challenging than it has ever been in your life, just like teaching is. And folks, you got to reach out to other people. People are there to help. There are resources available. And, I think we just have to come to this now with no judgment. When you look at educators, know they're doing the very best they can. When you look at parents, they're doing the very best they can. These are unprecedented times, and self-care is important. So I'm just going to kind of throw that out there.
Absolutely. Self-care. And I keep telling anybody I speak with, we have to give grace
Yes.
everywhere.
No judgment. Yep. We're
Because
all
like
doing
you
the best
said,
we can.
and we don't know what each of us are going through. We don't know what each of our students are
No.
going through. And just making sure, and even if it's like you said, as a parent, reach out, even if it's just an ear to listen right now. That's what some of us need. And I mean, as a parent myself, as the gifted supervisor is doing all of this, it can be daunting and overwhelming.
Sure.
And making sure that, like you said, it's not just the whole child, it's the whole person, it's the whole parent, it's all of us, making sure we have what we need. Because there's that old adage of you can't take care of others if you don't take care of yourself.
There's a lot of truth in that.
And I think that, as a parent, sometimes it's difficult to remember that we have to take care of ourselves. And it can be simply just reading an article, because let's say we have a child and that child is having a very difficult time and they're having a meltdown and they're emotionally, not stable. And we as a parent don't understand what to do and we're upset. Sometimes it's just reaching out and getting just that little piece of advice.
Exactly.
And making sure that we have what we need.
And there are great resources available. And if you have a particular thing that you want to do some reading on, let me know. Let Jessie know. We'll find some resources for you.
Well, I think that's all for this evening. Thank you, Dr. Inman, Dr. Roberts, and Dr. Evans for joining us. I will be posting the future sessions, which will start in January on the YouTube channel, so be on the lookout for those. But I bid you all a good night. Have a good evening. If you have not eaten dinner, go ahead and eat some dinner now. Stay nice and warm, and we will see you in January. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody. Stay healthy.